Communication disorders. The IDEA definition of communication disorders is defined as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Some things to think about as you're looking at individuals' communication is it's more than just verbalizations. We can look at language use, symbol use. Some of it might be speech for some students. For some students, it might be that they use manual signs like American Sign Language. Some students may use some type of communication board, whether it's a picture board or a voice output communication system. But we also need to keep in mind that there's other components of communication, things like the way that someone is carrying their body. Is it relaxed? Is it tense? What are they looking at? Are they looking at you? Are they looking at something else? What kind of facial expressions does the individual have? Some natural gestures and vocalizations. You oftentimes hear individuals who don't have good communication. You'll know as you get to know them that they have vocalizations that indicate that they are happy and vocalizations that indicate that they are unhappy. So the types of communication disorders, there's actually two types of communication disorders. Some individuals may have both, but more often than not, you'll find that an individual actually only either has a speech disorder or a language disorder. Speech disorders come in a variety of ways. Speech disorders are considered an impairment of voice, articulation of speech sounds, and/or fluency. So you may see these impairments in several different ways as the individual is speaking. So you may hear within the person's voice something that would be considered a voice disorder. It could be the absence or abnormal production of voice quality. So an individual may be very loud or very, very soft and not be able to necessarily modulate that. The pitch may not be appropriate. There may be a duration of speech that is short or long. You may find that they have difficulties in that regard. Articulation disorders are things that you've probably heard before as you hear young children oftentimes have articulation issues. Many of those things they outgrow. Other things, as they don't outgrow them, need to be addressed. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kinds of articulation disorders that are possible. Fluency disorders are oftentimes what folks think of as speech disorders, the kind of flow of verbal expression. If an individual stutters, actually, fluency disorders are the least frequent of the speech disorders, but potentially one of the most obvious speech disorders. So some types of articulation disorders that you may hear are distortions, sounds produced in an unfamiliar manner. Maybe the individual has a very nasal sounding voice. Substitutions, replacing one sound for another. For example, the ball is wed instead of the ball is red. The substitution of W instead of an R is a very frequent substitution that you hear in really young children. The issue becomes a problem when they don't actually outgrow that period of development. Omissions, when individuals omit sounds in a word. An example of that would be that they pay the piano instead of playing the piano. So they're leaving out a sound and it changes the meaning. Additions of sounds, so they're inserting extra sounds in a word. For example, saying I have a black horse instead of saying I have a black horse. A lot of times individuals that have articulation disorders, after a period of time, people that know them well actually can work around many of the things that they're doing and they understand what it is that they're trying to communicate. The challenge is, though, making sure that you go back and have them actually say the things correctly so that we can get to the point where they're no longer having difficulty leaving things out or putting things in or distorting their sounds. Language disorders come in a slightly different way. It's an impairment or deviant development of comprehension and or use of spoken, written, or other symbol systems. So the disorder may have difficulty with the form of language. phonological difficulties, morphological difficulties, and syntactical difficulties. So an individual who is having difficulty with phonology is having difficulty with the sound system of language and the linguistic rules that govern the sound system. Morphology is a linguistic rule system that governs the structure of words and the construction of word forms from the basic elements of meaning. And syntax is a linguistic rule that governs the order and combination of words to form sentences and the relationships among the elements within a sentence. So you may have students who have other challenges as well with the content of language. Oops. So they may have difficulty with the semantic system. So they may be having difficulty with the actual meaning and of words and sentences. Or they may have difficulty with the function of language and their actual communication system. So any difficulty that they may have that's expressed motorically, vocally, or verbally. There's a couple of possible ways that we can have students who have difficulty with communication, especially those who have difficulty with language disorders, communicate. So one system might be an aided system where an individual uses pictures, books, or some type of electronic display, like a voice output kind of communication system. Another option is an unaided system, which would be things like sign language, gestures, or non-symbolic behaviors. A non-symbolic behavior might be sort of leaning towards something that you like and pulling away from something that you don't like. There's several advantages to aided systems. They can be adapted very nicely to folks that have a variety of motoric and sensory needs, so they don't necessarily have to have really good fine motor skills. There's often devices that allow them to use other pieces of equipment to be able to use the device. Human aids scanning kind of increases the social closeness. So if a student were using pictures or some type of book to communicate, an individual who is communicating with them would have to get closer to them, so it creates more of an opportunity for a social interaction. The other thing that aided systems do is they're very helpful for folks that have difficulty processing other stimuli, because the information is right there in front of them. Advantages of unaided systems is that there's no problem with portability. You have your body is your communication system, and it goes with you wherever it is that you go. If you've ever seen somebody who is using American Sign Language as their means of communication, oftentimes they sign very, very quickly. So you can get your message across quite quickly as long as the receiver of your message understands what it is that you're saying. When you're using an unaided system, typically you are kind of face-to-face, having a more typical give and take type of interaction. It can also be used to teach grammatical structure. American Sign Language is considered a language. It has a grammatical structure, so in the process of teaching a student to use American Sign Language, we would also be teaching them grammar, which could then be hopefully generalized to using English language grammar. Some disadvantages with aided systems is there's problems with portability. If the student has a voice output communication device, it might be a little bit heavy. People may not necessarily want to carry it around. If a student has a notebook or a binder that they carry with a number of different pictures in it, and then sometimes folks don't want to carry that. So sometimes their system is in one place and they are in a different place. The other thing that happens with an aided system is the person who is the recipient of the communication is oftentimes paying attention to the display rather than the individual who's actually the message communicator. Efficiency is really dependent on the individual's motor state. So if the individual is fatigued or really excited, oftentimes it's difficult to use those systems because they're using their energy in other ways. Vocabulary expansion can sometimes be problematic. If an individual uses some type of picture communication system, you can only have so many pictures kind of at a time available to them. So it limits sometimes their ability to communicate a wide variety of pieces of information. Grammatically complete sentences are usually not done in many of the picture systems, so that can be another issue. It gets in the way of that individual learning grammar. And then probably potentially one of the biggest problems is that the system could get lost, or it could be left someplace, or it could be ruined, which at that point that person's ability to communicate is taken away. Sometimes students have systems that schools believe belong left at school. So at the end of the day, when the student leaves school, they basically leave their voice behind and are unable to communicate until they come back into school the following day. Some disadvantages of unaided systems are that American Sign Language requires really good motor control. So if the individual does not have good motor control and they end up having sort of sloppy signs or signs that are kind of their own signs, other people will not necessarily recognize what that means. The challenge for using sign language with individuals with more significant cognitive disabilities is that they oftentimes don't really get to the point where they are independent communicators. And probably one of the greatest challenges of an unaided system is it's very difficult to communicate with somebody who doesn't actually understand sign language. So that individual may have incredible fluency in sign language and be able to tell people who can sign with them a large number of things, lots of concepts and all sorts of things. But if they are with somebody who doesn't understand sign language, then they basically have no communication system. There's a video here that you can watch which will show you a voice output communication system. It is an advertisement for a particular type of system. This is not the only system that is available, but it gives you an idea of what a voice output communication system could look like. Some things that we want to think about as we have students in our classes that we think might have a language impairment. In the earlier grades, some of the challenges that we may see are problems in following verbal directions, difficulty with pre-academic skills, challenges with phonics, poor word attack skills, difficulties with structural analysis, problems learning new materials, and I actually said that already. So as students get into the intermediate grades, some things that might give us an indicator that they're having difficulty is that they're substituting words, that they have inadequate language processing and production that starts to affect their reading comprehension and academic achievement. At the middle and high school level, some things that you may see are an inability to understand abstract concepts, difficulty connecting previously learned information to new material that needs to be learned independently, widening gap in achievement when they are compared to their peers. So some things that you can do within the context of your classroom if you have a student who has a speech disorder is to talk with the student privately about the challenges that they have. Let them know that you are aware of their problem and how you believe that you could go about supporting them. With older students, you can ask them how they would like for you to support them in the classroom. You want to encourage interactions with the family. You want them to be able to support the students' educational communicative goals. Sometimes the challenge is that the family understands the individual, so they don't always ask them to speak clearly or to repeat things that they don't understand because they second guess what it is that they may be saying. Of course, along the lines of person first language, you don't want to think of the student as their disorder, so you would certainly not want to refer to a student in your class as the stutterer. You want to work closely with the speech and language pathologist to get strategies and support things that you can do within the context of the classroom. Encourage the student as you would any of the students in your classroom. Be positive as you would be with all of the students in your class. Be accepting of that child. Provide them opportunities to participate in oral group activities. For many students who have speech disorders, oftentimes they are hesitant to speak in class, or teachers are hesitant to call on them. So putting them in situations where they need to use their oral language skills is really important. Typically, it works best if you put them in smaller group situations to practice their skills. Speaking in front of the entire class may be problematic for some students. It may make them uncomfortable, or they may hesitate and not want to do so. You want to give students time to model and practice appropriate speech. You want to, if it is appropriate ethnically and culturally, you want to maintain eye contact with the student. You want to be a good listener. You certainly do not want to interrupt or finish the student's sentence. Even if you know what that individual is going to say, you want to make sure that they have the opportunity to complete their thought. So you don't want to cut them off. You don't want to stop them in the middle and try to finish what you think might be their thoughts. You want to give them time to say what it is that they wanted to say. When appropriate, you want to educate the rest of the class. The student with the speech disorder may be willing to share with the rest of the class some information about their speech disorder. The parent may be willing to do that, or the parent may give you permission to educate the rest of the class. Some things that you can do as far as instructional and material adaptations for students who have communication issues is to set up a system of motivators to encourage the student's efforts. So you want to make sure that you're providing that student with a lot of positive praise for all of their efforts. You might highlight material to identify key syllables and words in a passage to draw a student's attention to that. You could give the student opportunities to practice listening so that they can discriminate among sounds, fluent speech patterns, and good vocal habits. For a student who is working on more speech production, you may provide that student opportunities to record him or herself so that they can go back and listen to what it is that they've done. You also want to reduce the emphasis on competition. Competitive activities oftentimes will increase that student's stress and result in even more speech errors.